You thought the last batch was strange? Just wait, because what you're about to see takes weird American food to a whole new level. These next forgotten recipes weren't just experiments, they were statements, served proudly in Tupperware and on floral china, at picnics, luncheons, and suburban dinner parties. Some were sweet, some were savory, and some, you'll wonder how they ever existed at all. From a tropical twist on a canned meat classic to a jellied egg salad that wobbled its way onto tables across the country. This list will mess with everything you thought you knew about mid-century cuisine. We'll uncover the bizarre obsession with stuffing, molding, and gelatinizing anything that stood still, and the unholy unions like grapes and sausage or icebox cake made with Velveeta. These are dishes that defined an era, strange, resourceful, oddly beautiful, and unforgettable. But be warned, once you've seen what's coming, there's no going back. So before we dive deeper into this surreal culinary time capsule, do me one favor. Hit like, drop a comment with the dish that shocks you the most, and don't forget to subscribe for even more vintage food mysteries from America's Forgotten Kitchen. All right, take a deep breath, because the next plate might just break your brain. Molded chicken liver salad. The mid-century dare you didn't expect. There's vintage, and then there's this. Molded chicken liver salad wasn't just food. It was a test of character. Emerging in the gelatin-obsessed 1950s, this dish came from a time when anything, and I mean anything, could be suspended in Jell-O and proudly served to guests. At first glance, it looked like a creamy mousse, maybe something fancy. But one bite in, and you'd meet the bold, earthy flavor of cooked chicken liver, pureed to a velvety smoothness and blended with mayonnaise, chopped hard-boiled eggs, and just enough lemon juice to cut the richness. Then came the unmissable zing of pimentos or green olives, adding color and confusion in equal measure. It was all poured into a ring mold, chilled to the perfect wobble, and ceremoniously unmolded onto a plate surrounded by crackers, celery sticks, or if the hostess was especially daring, slices of canned pineapple. But why liver? And why gelatin? Because during post-war America, thrift and glamour had a share plate. Liver was cheap and nutrient-dense, a darling of Depression-era kitchens, while gelatin molds offered visual flair without added cost. In magazines and cookbooks, these molded salads were portrayed as upscale, sophisticated, almost French. But the taste? That was all-American boldness. Guests were expected to smile and compliment. Kids were told it was fancy meat dip. And somewhere between politeness and peer pressure, people learned to like it. Molded chicken liver salad may not be coming back anytime soon, but it holds a rightful place in America's culinary time capsule. Because in mid-century kitchens, bravery wasn't just served, it was molded, chilled, and garnished. Stay tuned. The next one might just shock you more. Cottage cheese pineapple toppers, dessert or dinner. You decide. It's sweet, it's savory, it's confusing. But in vintage America, it was a showstopper. Cottage cheese pineapple toppers came from the colorful craze of the 1950s and early 60s, a time when canned fruit reigned supreme and diets were marketed with glossy magazine smiles. And right there, on countless dinner tables and lunch trays, sat this culinary contradiction. A golden ring of canned pineapple, glistening in syrup, was placed delicately on a bed of crisp iceberg lettuce. Right in the center, a snowy scoop of cottage cheese, sometimes plain, sometimes mixed with a dash of mayo or a few maraschino cherry bits for flair. Sprinkle a little paprika or top it with a mint leaf, and suddenly you had yourself a balanced meal, or what passed for one. It was sweet, tangy, salty, and cold. A textural mashup that puzzled the senses and still found a fan base. Housewives served it as a light luncheon. Cafeterias called it fruit salad. Some kids thought it was dessert. No one really knew, but everyone had an opinion. Behind the confusion was a clever bit of nutrition marketing. Cottage cheese had protein. Pineapple had vitamin C. Together, they made a diet-friendly, no-cook, visually neat little plate that said, "Look, I tried." And for a generation raised on simplicity and shelf-stable convenience, that was enough. Today, it might sound like a weird leftover from a hospital tray, but back then, it was elegant, practical, even chic. Because when time was short and presentation mattered, you reached for the can opener. And somehow, against all odds, this little ring of contrast became a vintage classic. Still curious? Good, because what's coming next might just break your brain. Anchovy stuffed eggs on saltines, the salty snack that refused to apologize. Before umami became a culinary buzzword, America had anchovies. And in the post-war era, when appetizers had to be bold, portable, and pantry-ready, anchovy stuffed eggs on saltines became a salty little sensation. It started with hard-boiled eggs, halved and hollowed. The yolks weren't just mashed with mayo. They were whipped with anchovy paste, dry mustard, vinegar, and sometimes even a dash of Worcestershire sauce. The goal? Maximum punch in every bite. These weren't your picnic deviled eggs. These were a briny uppercut to the taste buds. But it didn't stop there. Instead of being served neatly on a tray, these devilishly dense egg halves were perched atop plain saltine crackers. Why? Because the crunch balanced the creaminess. The blandness of the cracker absorbed the salt. And, most importantly, it made them finger food, perfect for bridge clubs, cocktail parties, and church luncheons where every hostess wanted to serve something different. They were unapologetically strong, fishy, tangy, addictive to some, repulsive to others. But they dared to stand out. In the 1950s and 60s, anchovies were considered chic, a European import that gave American dishes a little sophistication. Combine that with eggs, another Depression-era staple, and saltines, the humble workhorse of every kitchen, and you had a layered snack that told story. A story of ambition, of trying something new, of turning leftovers and shelf-stable foods into something cocktail-worthy. Today, you might swipe past it on Pinterest with a wince. But back then, it was a crowd pleaser, a conversation starter, a recipe clipped out and mailed to sisters in other states. Because when flavor came first and budget came second, anchovy stuffed eggs on crackers ruled the table. Canned pea pate, the green mystery of mid-century menus. It looked like guacamole, but oh, it wasn't. It spread like butter, but didn't melt. It sat proudly on trays, wrapped in parsley sprigs or piped into celery boats, leaving everyone wondering, what is that green stuff? Welcome to the odd but oddly beloved world of canned pea pate, a vintage appetizer that baffled the eye but pleased the palate of a very specific crowd. Born from a mix of post-war convenience and culinary experimentation, this dish was all about transformation. Housewives would open a can of mushy green peas. Yes, the kind you usually push to the side of your plate, and blend them with softened cream cheese, a dash of onion powder, maybe some lemon juice, and a hint of gelatin to firm it all up. The result? A smooth, pastel green spread that could be molded, sliced, or dolloped at will. Served with Ritz crackers or stuffed into cherry tomatoes. It was considered classy. In fact, during the 1960s, anything in pate form felt upscale, even if it came from a 15-cent can. This was the era of reinvention, when American kitchens weren't afraid to take chances. Green didn't mean fresh, it meant creative. And if you could turn peas into a party spread, you were winning the hostess game. But let's be honest, it wasn't for everyone. The texture was soft but dense. The color was questionable. And for those who didn't grow up with it, the idea of pureed peas as finger food might sound like culinary sabotage. Still, this was a dish that whispered of pride, of post-war optimism, of making the most of what you had and doing it with flair. Because in the world of vintage recipes, even a can of peas could become a conversation piece. Beet and horseradish logs, when color was king. If there was ever a dish that looked like it came straight from an abstract painting, this was it. A magenta roll, cold and gleaming, sliced into vivid spirals and served on a silver tray like some forbidden delicacy. Beet and horseradish logs. They weren't just food, they were a statement. Popular in the late 1950s and early 60s, this recipe was born during America's obsession with color, contrast, and a little culinary chaos. Housewives wanted vibrancy on the table, something that popped against the green of parsley and the white of linen. And what better way than with beets? The base was simple. Canned beets, grated finely and mixed with softened cream cheese, but not just any cheese. It had to be whipped to perfection. Then came the kick. Horseradish, added just enough to clear the sinuses, but not enough to send guests running. This mixture was then chilled into log shapes using wax paper, sometimes layered over a thin slice of bread or gelatin base for extra firmness. Once firmed, the log was sliced into bright, tie-dye-like rounds, each one a swirl of sweet, earthy beet and nose-tingling spice. Guests either loved it or avoided it like a dare. But hosts didn't care because it looked stunning. That's what mattered in a world where appearance on the buffet table was half the battle. Beet and horseradish logs reflected a deeper cultural shift. Presentation over practicality. It wasn't about nutrition. It wasn't even about flavor. It was about catching the eye, starting conversations, and proving that even humble pantry staples could be turned into edible art. And while today's guests might blink twice at these purple pinwheels, there's no denying they were unforgettable. The kind of appetizer that lived longer in memory than on the plate. Because in vintage American kitchens, if it could be molded, sliced, and make someone gasp, it was a hit. Crushed potato chip cheese balls. The crunch heard round the room. Imagine this. It's 1965. The living room is packed with neighbors in polyester suits and polka dot dresses, sipping punch and murmuring about the Cold War, until someone brings out the cheese balls. But these weren't just any cheese balls. They were crushed potato chip cheese balls, glittering in a golden coat of salty shards, shimmering under the chandelier light like culinary disco balls. Born from the cocktail party craze of the post-war era, these savory spheres became the go-to centerpiece for suburban get-togethers. They were made with cream cheese, always the base, mixed with sharp cheddar or blue cheese, minced pimentos, maybe a splash of Worcestershire sauce if the hostess was feeling bold. But the magic? That came at the very end. Once shaped into little spheres, they were rolled, not in nuts or herbs like you might expect, but in hand-crushed potato chips. The salt, the crunch, the unapologetic embrace of processed comfort. This was mid-century America flaunting convenience and charm in one glorious bite. No one at the party cared about calories. No one asked about the sodium. All they knew was that the outside crunched, the inside melted, and the combination was electric. And when you bit into one, you didn't just taste cheese and chips. You tasted confidence. A kind of culinary swagger that said, yes, I crushed an entire bag of Lay's for this appetizer. And yes, you're going to ask for the recipe. These cheese balls weren't about health, restraint, or refinement. They were about fun, about hosting without stress, about turning everyday snacks into unforgettable showstoppers. Today, we'd call them retro, maybe even kitschy. But back then, crushed potato chip cheese balls were a triumph. Crunchy, cheesy proof that you didn't need a silver spoon to throw a five-star party. Because in vintage kitchens, if it made a satisfying crunch and got people talking, jelly bologna loaf, when meat met mold and nobody blinked. There are forgotten recipes. And then there are dishes so bizarre, so mind-bendingly vintage that they feel like fever dreams from another culinary dimension. Enter the jellied bologna loaf, a shimmering, pink-hued block of molded meat and mystery. This towering gelatinous creation once graced the tables of mid-century America with unflinching pride. Picture it, diced bologna, not sliced, diced, suspended in a savory, translucent sea of tomato gelatin, speckled with chopped onions, celery, and the occasional pickle. The whole thing was poured into a loaf pan, chilled until solid, and then sliced into slabs of cold, wobbly wonder. And the best part? It was served with mayo. Always mayo. Now, before you recoil, know this. In the 1950s and 60s, this was the height of culinary sophistication. Jellied dishes were status symbols. Housewives who could properly mold a gelatin loaf were seen as skilled, stylish, and deeply resourceful. The jelly bologna loaf wasn't just food, it was edible architecture. It combined everything the era celebrated: economy, creativity, and spectacle. Bologna was affordable and always on hand. Gelatin made anything stretch further. And the result? A loaf that could feed a crowd and spark conversation in one fell slice. The texture was divisive. The flavor? Surprisingly tangy. And the visual? Somewhere between a science project and a potluck Picasso. But back then, no one batted an eye. This was American ingenuity on full, quivering display, where thrift met presentation and nothing went to waste. Today, the jelly bologna loaf may seem more prank than platter, but in its prime, it symbolized something bigger, a fearless time in food history when the mold wasn't just a container, it was a canvas. Because if you could turn lunch meat into sculpture, you weren't just cooking, you were creating. Oyster cracker meat, nachos, when dinner time got desperate. Forget everything you know about nachos. Because in the mid-century American kitchen, cheese-covered tortilla chips were nowhere in sight. Instead, we got oyster cracker meat, nachos, a recipe that sounded like a dare and tasted like improvisation at its most unapologetic. At first glance, this dish looks more like something you'd throw together at midnight when the fridge was bare and payday was still 2 days away. But in many 1950s and 60s households, it was a deliberate dinner choice, a strange yet thrifty spin on something exotic and new. Here's how it worked. Start with a bed of oyster crackers. Yes, the ones usually floating in tomato soup. These salty, crunchy mini bites were arranged like chips on a tray. Then came the topping, brown ground beef, often mixed with ketchup, Worcestershire sauce, maybe a dash of mustard or relish, whatever was on hand. And then, the kicker, shredded American cheese, melted just enough to glue it all together, forming a gooey, golden crust over a bed of crackers that softened under the weight, but never gave up their salty crunch entirely. Some home cooks sprinkled in chopped onions. Others added pimento or olives for flair. But make no mistake, this was survival food disguised as a party platter. Why oyster crackers? Because they were cheap, shelf-stable, and small enough to trick the eye into thinking this dish was more appetizer than emergency. These nachos weren't trying to be Tex-Mex. They weren't even trying to be normal. They were born of ingenuity, born of frugality, the classic American tale of stretching ingredients and bending tradition until something new emerged, however odd it looked. Today, oyster cracker meat nachos might seem absurd, but back then, they were a snapshot of a culture learning to adapt, stretch, and snack its way through tight times. Because when tortilla chips weren't in the pantry, fruit cocktail and mayo canapes, the sweet-savory collision no one expected. There are food combinations that raise eyebrows, and then there's fruit cocktail and mayonnaise. On toast, served as canapes. Yes, this was real, and not just real, but fashionable for a peculiar slice of mid-20th century America. Born from the cocktail party craze of the 1950s, these canapés were an attempt to appear sophisticated with the most unlikely cast of ingredients. Picture it: tiny triangles of white bread, lightly toasted, topped with a dollop of mayonnaise, the store-bought kind, and then artfully crowned with syrupy bits of fruit cocktail. A cherry here, a cube of pear or peach there, maybe a grape if you were lucky. To us, it sounds like a sugar-coated horror story. But back then, this dish represented something bold: the new American obsession with modern convenience and unexpected elegance. Fruit cocktail, canned and mass-produced, was a pantry staple. Mayonnaise had just become industrialized and widely marketed as the creamy glue of the modern kitchen. Combine them, and you had something sweet, savory, creamy, and chewy, all in one bite. Strange? Absolutely. Memorable? Definitely. These weren't created for kids. They were grown-up hors d'oeuvres, offered at bridge clubs, luncheons, and holiday open houses. Housewives prided themselves on their flair for innovation. No cookbooks required, just imagination and maybe a little desperation. There was a kind of culinary daring happening in these years. Lines between dessert and dinner blurred. Convenience ruled. And presentation was everything, even if the flavors didn't quite make sense. Today, we might call it a joke recipe, something fit for retro potluck irony. But when you understand the era's hunger for novelty and the post-war boom of processed food marketing, it all clicks into place. Because in vintage America, the weirder the bite, the more likely it was to be remembered. So, now you've seen them. The forgotten, the bizarre, the bold dishes that once graced dinner tables across America and now live only in whispers, yellowed cookbooks, and faded memories. But here's the thing: these weren't just meals. They were statements. They told stories about wartime scarcity, post-war pride, suburban experimentation, and the American obsession with convenience and presentation. From molded liver salads to marshmallows wrapped in bacon, every recipe had a reason, a purpose, a moment in time. And whether they made you chuckle, cringe, or crave a bite out of pure curiosity, they mattered. Because food isn't just about taste. It's about history, identity, survival. And sometimes, it's about throwing caution to the wind and serving pineapple chunks on a saltine with a smear of anchovy paste just to see what happens. What if we told you this is only half the story? Oh yes, there are more. Even stranger, even more forgotten. Hidden deeper in the pages of vintage magazines and community cookbooks no one reads anymore. Recipes that will leave you gasping, laughing, and maybe even wondering how close we came to serving them at your last family picnic. So, if you're as fascinated by these edible artifacts as we are, if you're hungry for more forgotten flavors, lost techniques, and food stories history nearly erased, then now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell icon, drop a like, and tell us in the comments, which dish shocked you the most? Because next time, we're going even deeper. More gelatin, more mayo, more madness. This isn't just a food channel. This is where American culinary history comes back to life, one bite at a time. Stay curious, stay bold, and we'll see you in the next plate of forgotten flavor.